So I'm not really talking about affect here, but I'm talking about something that affect theorists are incredibly interested in. So if you're one of those, you'll find this useful, if not illuminating theoretically. What I'm really doing is taking a feminist epistemological lens to a subject that has been incredibly interesting for lots of people, quite controversial, and has become sort of tantalizing for affect theory. And there's been a bit of a debate recently about affect theorists' appropriation of neuroscience, and whether or not they're appropriating neuroscience with or without its reductionist and determinist baggage. So this particular piece, which is a chapter in the book I'm writing now, which is called The Biocultural Brain, looks at mirror neurons as one case in which we might rethink, along the lines of the neo-materialist angle that Trish was just talking about, we might rethink their meaning or their significance in a way that could render them less objectionable and more useful for affect theory, as well as more amenable to feminist thinking. So let me begin by pointing out that feminists don't agree on that much, but there are a few things that we agree on. One of them is that human relationality is what nurture, not nature, accomplishes. That has been a key feminist principle for an incredibly long time. It's now coming under some heat and some challenge from some of the very theorists that Tricia was describing, and those are people that I'm reading now too, Ken Barad and Elizabeth Gross especially. Parisi is my next challenge, as you can imagine. So the hard-won view in feminism, of course, is that human relationality is nurture, not nature. So think about our abilities to enter into social relations, in particular, our ability to experience each other's point of view, what some people call mind reading, my ability to know what Tricia might be thinking when she's picking up that pen there, our abilities to coordinate actions and also to empathize. Our arguments have been that they have been given by, are not given by nature, through our neurobiology. That is indeed, in fact, the argument that is now being proposed in social neuroscience. So this raises the specter of biological determinism and essentialism, of course. And not only does this proposal open up the self to an array of bio-ontological claims, but it also biologizes social ties between selves and communities that most feminists believe to be culturally constructed. Now, a few caveats. Let's just imagine I have a little pot here filled with scare quotes. And I don't really want to go like this during the entire talk, but all of these terms are really contentious, and I recognize that, so let me just put that out there. I recognize that feminist epistemology is actually epistemologies, and that feminists rarely agree on much, and that my description of mirror neurons will sound in some ways reifying because I'm trying to get at the real in the sense that Patricia was talking about. So liberally imagine scare quotes, but at the same time, let's try to think about the problematizations of matter that Patricia talked about. This constant need to use scare quotes with every reference to the body or biology, or the brain or the mind as a biological phenomenon. And maybe we can do without some of those scare quotes if we can pursue. Hi Maya, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll use the scare quotes. You don't have to leave. Honestly, you can do what you want, but I write with two children screaming most of the time. So in some ways, this whole talk and the folks that Patricia's writing about are trying to get at how we might get rid of scare quotes and still be feminists. So how many of you know about mirror neurons? Oh, thank goodness. So I'll just give you the little quick summary, and assuming you can fill in some of the details, because my real interest is really not so much in mirror neurons themselves, but rather in how we might think about them in biocultural ways rather than in reductionist and determinist ways. So the widely touted discovery of mirror neurons in monkeys in the early 1990s and the subsequent finding of them in humans, I think Jesse, the scare quotes there for you. That's a matter of debate whether they really exist in humans, has generated intense scientific interest in the neurobiology of intersubjectivity. And again, intersubjectivity here is a kind of, is limited to those three things that I mentioned earlier: the ability to know what another person is thinking or intends in their actions, the ability to coordinate actions between people, and the capacity to empathize or feel what another person is feeling. Okay, but those are pretty big things, even if that's a small list. So social neuroscientists have claimed that mirror neurons, which are located in brain regions, I'm going to not do that anymore, but are purported to be located in brain regions related to motor action, facial recognition, and somatosensory processing, allow us to automatically grasp other people's intentions and emotions. So through mirror neurons, the human capacities for mind reading and empathy are being rethought as inbuilt, automatic, and pre-linguistic neural capacities. And there's been a whole lot of neuromania around this subject. So in 2006, Sandra Blakesley wrote this article in the New York Times, which is just one of many that declared that mirror neurons were basically the solution to every possible philosophical problem related to the mind. It's going to overturn philosophy and cultural studies and also cure autism, which is really interesting. So we'll look into that later. But outside the lab, which is really my interest here, mirror neurons are animating, materialist, affective, and embodied accounts of intersubjectivity, particularly in cultural studies, where affect theorists are utilizing, and let's point out here that by affect here I mean affect in the sense that Patricia is using it, not affect in the sense that the psychologists and the neuroscientists are using it, whereby they really mean emotion, sort of the realm of emotion. And in cultural studies, affect is limited to the preconscious experience, the felt experience, embodied experience. But affect theorists are using mirror neurons and other neuroscientific findings to rethink relationality, or the connection, the transcorporeality or intercorporeality, in embodied and non-representationalist terms. So this is incredibly important and interesting. I'm going to have to cut a little bit here because I think we started late. But my view is that mirror neurons raise issues that are incredibly relevant to both feminist theory and cultural studies. But interventions are needed for this work to be compatible with non-reductionist thought. They really can't be simply cited. This research really shouldn't be cited in cultural studies work that is intent on being open-ended and neo-materialist without some kind of clarifying interventions. Now, in this work, I'm using some feminist thinking in order to clarify what I think are some of the problems with mirror neuron research. But I want to add that so far, up until recently, up until the events that Patricia described, feminist theory has been disappointingly disembodied, in the sense that it has been obsessed with the body but avoided biology. Okay, so acknowledging that, nonetheless, I think we can draw lessons from feminist epistemology, combined with neo-feminist materialism, to look at alternative views against the dominant views of mirror neurons in cognitive science and philosophy of mind, to think about a prospect for a biocultural view of mirror neurons, one that avoids these nature-culture dichotomies that are at play in much of the debate over neuroscience and its appropriation in cultural studies and other realms of social thinking. So this is part of a broader project. Mirror neurons is only one chapter. I'm also looking at brain plasticity in another chapter, and neuromodulating hormones and other subjects, all of which I'm going to make attempts to intervene in dominant narratives to think through perhaps neo-materialist or biocultural interpretations of each of these. So, having said that, there's a huge conversation that one can have about the possibilities and the problems of having some kind of rapprochement between feminism and neuroscience. And that's not the subject of my talk here, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A because it's an incredibly difficult problem. So, what are mirror neurons? Just to sum, we'll go through this quickly since almost all of you know what they are. Okay, neurons that fire both when an individual makes a motor action and when she sees another performing the same action. So if I see Maria, a neuron scholar herself, picking up an ice cream cone and eating it, then the idea is that the neurons in my brain, in my premotor cortex maybe, that would have been employed to pick up my own ice cream cone fire when I watch Maria pick up her ice cream cone. Now, not all of them fire, because if they did, then I would be picking up an ice cream cone too. But some of them fire. So the idea here is that action and perception are coupled. Right? So this is a discovery of the 1990s neuroscience that's incredibly important. So the dominant interpretation is that that these neurons are thought to stimulate without executing the action of another. An incredibly interesting point, too, is that mirror neurons have since been found, scare quotes, mostly through fMRI studies, which are themselves problematic, as Joe Dennett has told us, in areas associated with facial expression, and also with somatosensory experience. Right? So, in other words, I might have a mirroring of Maria's smile, or I might have a mirroring of seeing her in pain. Okay. So, Maya, thank you so much for coming. I really needed you here. That's the youngest member of the audience, who is, well, we'll debate whether or not she has a neuron system already. That's part of the debate that I'll be engaging with. So because mirror neurons are thought to register or map another's actions in one's own brain as if performing the action oneself, they're thought to simulate the motor action of another. And neuron researchers see this as evidence of action understanding, or what they call motor attunements, whereby another's goal for action or her intention in acting is registered by the observer. And there's some other details about mirror neuron research that make this a little bit more clear. For example, it appears that I can, my mirror neurons might fire if I see Maria. I see some partial movement. Maybe it's occluded by a screen or something. But I see the end goal as the ice cream cone. I may have a mirroring experience then too. And the interpretation then is that this suggests some kind of preconscious notion of her intention to pick up the ice cream cone, right? So this is, of course, contrary to classical top-down models that see interpersonal understanding as based on cognitive mind reading, right? Where one theorizes about another person's intentions. So you can already see why this is kind of tantalizing for affect theory, right? Sorry, I didn't say it for weeks, but I'm going to do it. There's the coding's in that bag. If I give the signal, we'll get a little high. Very nice. Okay, so here are some incredibly interesting claims made about mirror neurons. That they allow no less than a, quote, direct experiential grasp of the minds of others, unquote. So Vittorio Galeazzi is the person I'm going to be quoting most in this paper, and he's one of the primary researchers who initially discovered mirror neurons, and he's also done quite a lot to advocate their significance. And he also, along with Alvin Goldman, came up with the primary model to understand them, which I'll be talking about, embodied simulation theory. So Galeazzi is, in his own words, quote, challenging the notion that the sole account of interpersonal understanding consists in explicitly attributing to others propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires, mapped as symbolic representations. This is a real anti-symbolic case. So before and below mind reading is intercorporeity as the main source of knowledge we directly gather about others. So the main source of knowledge I have in italics here, because I think that's an incredibly interesting claim. So the broad proposition that mirror neurons are the neural substrate of social cognition, and the more specific claim that they constitute a form of preconscious knowledge of the other, is supported by these findings I mentioned that find mirror neurons firing in response to facial expressions and other communicative actions, and also upon observing or perceiving another's sensory perceptions. Right? On this basis, mirror neurons are thought to be the biological foundation of human empathy. It's a pretty incredible. So Glaze and Rizzolatti argue that with this mirroring mechanism, we do not just see or hear an action or emotion. Side by side with the sensory description of the observed social stimuli, internal representations of the state associated with these actions or emotions are evoked in the observer, as if they were performing a similar action or experiencing a similar emotion. So one subject I'm not going to mention here, but I want to sort of just throw it out there as something to keep in mind. I'm not going to elaborate, is that there are pretty considerable methodological limitations to mirror neuron research, and there are also a range of critiques of the research that are going on right now. So these include that almost all the research comes from fMRI studies, which are pretty they're pretty imprecise, to say the least, and the research that's come from single cell recording studies, which are much more precise, haven't yet been replicated. And Jesse, you don't even believe that study really established mirror neurons in humans. So there are some very smart people who think that we haven't even established that mirror neuron systems exist in humans. However, let me point out that the research is proceeding apace nonetheless. I did this search of the studies on mirror neuron research since 1999 to 2009, and they're rising exponentially. So this is becoming, there's kind of a mirror neuron industry going on now in the scientific communities, despite the considerable controversy. Also, compared with other multisensory neurons, Celia Hayes argues that very little is known about them, about their development and their individual network computations. And she says, while other smart neurons are usually understood to be components, important parts of a complex system, which both need and yield explanation, mirror neurons are at the risk of being viewed as atoms, or this atomistic model, primitive entities whose very existence explains a range of cognitive and behavioral phenomena. And I think that's a pretty valid critique. But the strongest proponents of mirror neurons, including Marco Iacoboni and Rizzolatti and Glaze, particularly Glaze, argue that intersubjectivity is founded at automatic neural level in individual brains. Affect theorists like to use the word autonomic, but you can't use it here in this context because it means something different in neuroscience. I learned by misusing it. So they argue not only that intersubjectivity has a strong physiological and neuronal substrate, but that it depends more fundamentally on non-symbolic neural processes than on conscious symbolic language-based mental deliberations. Further, embodied simulation is understood to be evolutionarily adaptive and universal. So that means Maya back there already has a mirror neuron system. And at this quote-unquote primitive or rudimentary level, I'm quoting here from, I think, Suzanne McKean, human beings are basically similar to one another with a limited range of variations. So gosh, feminists would, collapse right about it. So obviously this work raises significant problems of essentialism and determinism. And yet, mirror neurons are also described in non-reductionist ways. I think some of the descriptions I've already given are kind of tantalizing despite their political problems. And sometimes by the very same researchers that make other claims that are hugely problematic. For example, Glaze is constantly talking about the dynamic interaction between brain, mind, and world. And he's quite excited to be challenging the disembodied versions of intersubjectivity in cognitive theory. So on those grounds, there's there is some kind of things in cultural resonance. So I want to sort through the neuroscientific interpretations of mirror neurons in order to get a little bit more clarity on that paradox, which I find really interesting. So how many people know this stuff? So how many philosophers are in the room? Yeah. Maya, Kate, Jessie, Maria. Okay, so this is new for you, and this kind of language is new for me too. I think the idea of having a theory is really ridiculous. But mirror neurons have been employed to contest cognitive views of theory of mind or mind reading So what is that? The notion that our ability to understand the perspective of the other is a higher order process of intentional cognition, depending upon symbols. It's executed through mental application of, good girl. It's executed through the mental application of behavioral principles or sort of folk theories about how other people think, so it's called theory of theory. So I know that Patricia's going to eat this ice cream cone because I know that people generally, except her probably, she is a really bad example, doesn't really eat, but people generally like to eat ice cream, and that people reach for food like she's doing because they want to eat it. So this is a good example because it shows how problematic this theory is, right? It doesn't really work. So I apply such general principles from folk psychology to make sense of another person's actions. So these are principles drawn from concepts that are symbolic representations of the world, whose validity depends on the extent of correspondence with the world. So thinking then can be understood as the computation of abstract symbols. So the primary alternative is simulation theory. So the pre-neuron version was advanced by a couple of people, including Alvin Goldman, which argues that we understand another's actions not through applying some kind of generic principles that we've learned, but rather by simulating or pretending how we might act in the same situation ourselves. So I know that Patricia wants to eat that ice cream cone because I imagine myself picking up the ice cream cone and wanting to eat it. So I put myself in her shoes. So my understanding of her desire is dependent in some way on my ability to imagine my own desire, as well as my ability to see her as me and not me at the same time. So Goldman's theory rejects general abstract reasoning in favor of a capacity to imagine oneself within a particular context in the shoes of the other. So it locates our understanding of others within our own self-awareness. So in this sense, it has some advantages, I think, from many feminist points of view. It's less abstract, more personal, and more located in one's own situation. But both theories ultimately see mind reading as a kind of folk theorizing event, ultimately about another person's state, and they favor representationalist and rationalist mental knowledge over other kinds of experience, like the affective. So Catherine Nelson, who's a feminist psychologist, has argued that both of these theories remain a disembodied, that in these theories, mind is a disembodied, autonomous, individually owned processing or representational device, some kind of cognitive mechanism that provides representations that mirror the real world out there, and she claims that these are antithetical to the principles of feminist epistemologies. I agree. I think she's right about that. So enter mirror neurons. So in the past decade, simulation has become the dominant philosophical model through which to interpret mirror neurons, so much so that mirroring is now regularly referred to as neural simulation. However, this version of simulation theory replaces the symbolic representation and cognitive calculation with the automatic capacities of the brain. So in the late 1990s, Goldman and Gallese wrote a paper together. Gallese is getting really good at that, and expanding the range of mirror neuron thinking beyond neuroscience by collaborating with others. I'm going to mention a few other collaborations that come up with Lakoff and with David Freeberg. So they argued together that it's mirror neurons that underlie the process of mind reading, or they serve at least as precursors to such a process through embodied simulation. So adding neurons, adding the brain, makes simulation an embodied experience, but it also becomes preconscious rather than conscious. So Goldman has since qualified his position. He's made some moves to distinguish cognitive and preconscious forms of simulation. But Gallese, on the other hand, and other strong proponents of embodied simulation theory, argue that neural mirroring constitutes the main basis for our knowledge of other people. So this theory, embodied simulation theory, shifts simulation from being the work of an effortful mind to that of being a brain effortlessly receiving knowledge of another. So through mirroring, putting oneself in another's shoes is a biologically mandated mechanism achieved something like 30 to 100 milliseconds after perceiving the other's sensory, motor, or emotional actions and experiences. So the strong view of mirror neurons, not everybody takes the strong view, but the strong view advocated by Gallese and embraced by a number of his colleagues, make several claims. So I'm quoting directly so that I don't seem like I'm being hyperbolic, although the italics are my own. First, while mirror neurons work without cognition, introspection, or mental effort, they are understood to provide substantial intersubjective knowledge. So Glaser and Legoff put it, by means of embodied simulation, when witnessing others' behavior, their intentions can be directly grasped without the need of representing them in propositional form. Mirror neurons enable the direct comprehension of the action of others. Second, Gallese, Kaisers, and Rizzotti argue that neural mirroring of emotions is more crucial than cognitive modes of transmitting emotional meanings. So mirroring is the fundamental mechanism at the basis of experiential understanding of others' actions and emotions. Also, mirroring scaffolds the cognitive description, and when the former mechanism is not present or malfunctioning, think of the cases of autism, because it's where they're going with this. The latter provides only a pale, detached account of the emotions of others. So if I see my friend Andrew cry, Andrew's not here, so we can talk about him. Mirroring is what gives me a connected, fundamental experience of his emotional state, and if I didn't have that, my comprehension of his crying would be shallow and indifferent. And finally, in contrast to cognitive efforts, this basis of our understanding of others is free of the ambiguity or errors of symbolic interpretation. This is my favorite part. Mirroring is a, who am I quoting here? Gosh, it would be useful to know because it's such a crazy quote. And I don't remember. Mirroring is a, quote, mechanism or prepackaged process that normally guarantees success, i.e. genuine matching or resemblance. That's actually Alvin Goldman, making a distinction between neural simulation and the other kind of simulation. He actually says that neural simulation is a lot more reliable. Right? So meaning is transferred rather than created. So to quote Robert Gordon, who's another simulation theorist, the sight of another living human or even human-like body, in some of the research, deposits in one's brain motor plans, sensory responses, and the basic intentions of another. Wow, right? Yeah. You can see why this is a really important topic for feminists to think about. So when we do bring in the body and the brain into body studies, this is what we might get. So here's the happy side, from my point of view at least. On the happy side, I think from the point of view of both feminism and cultural studies too, embodied simulation theory does some nice things. It contests abstract, rational, and detached versions of mind that have been so dominant in cognitive science and philosophy. And it posits the fundamentally embodied character of social cognition. The theory places knowing firmly within the body and endorses the role of feeling and understanding. Rather than computation or calculation, knowing is described as grasping, attunement, resonance, or awareness. And mirror neurons also deliver some biological specificity to descriptions of affect. So for example, people like William Connolly, Claire Kohlberg, Heidi Rabin, and Rainer Krauss have discussed them in relation to affect. And mirror neurons have been linked to some of Freud's ideas of bodily forms of empathy. So in these ways, the neuroscientific literature on mirror neurons resonates with feminist and other critical epistemologies, but I think you all already know that there are considerable divergences that need to be thought about in these assumptions, particularly in assumptions underlying feminist ideas of embodied knowing and the theory of embodied simulation. So I think these differences illuminate conceptual weaknesses in the dominant interpretation of mirror neurons, and they open up possibilities for more critical elucidations of them. So while feminist, as you just heard for a fascinating hour, while feminist epistemology is itself undergoing revision, it's really shifting to feminist ontology, right? Particularly in terms of its handling of biology, its engagement with neuroscience can open up a critical exploration of mirroring. Among the concerns feminist epistemologies bring to biological accounts of social cognition include the following: the situatedness of knowledge, the diversity of bodies and embodied experiences, the significance of social interaction, and the role of experience in learning and knowledge production. So I'm going to take each one of those and sort of compare feminist and neuroscientific interpretations. And now when I'm saying neuroscientific, I'm really referring to embodied simulation theories. I'm referring to the strong views of Gallese and not the views of other folks who I'm going to rely on later to rethink this. So while both frameworks draw on the body to make sense of intersubjectivity, conceptions of embodiment in feminism and neuroscience are incredibly different. So you're going to have to indulge me in kind of generalizing the whole history of feminist thinking on the body in order to make this comparison. So I do recognize that it's very complex. But feminists have insisted on the embodied nature of all vision, and this is Donna Haraway's language, as a way of opposing the objectivist idea of an omniscient view from nowhere. And on the whole, feminists have agreed that the epistemological effects of the body are not primarily due to biology, but rather to social parameters. Embodiment is both enabling and constraining, but this is not, in most feminist theory, due to its organic qualities. Rather, it's because it is the condition of locatedness that ensures the situated character of knowing. So the senses through which we perceive the world help us achieve not transcendent, universal, or objective knowledge, but rather an embedded and particular view of the world. And this theme resonates across multiple feminist frameworks. And I have a paragraph here describing standpoint theory and feminist empiricism, and also postmodern and post-structuralist feminism. And there are different takes on this, but I don't think we need to go into that, and I'm happy to discuss it later. But maybe you'll just allow me that I can say that feminists on the whole have rejected any essential truth to biology, of the body provided by biology, and have insisted on variations in lived experience that ensure that embodied knowledge is radically and irreducibly multiple. So Helen Longino puts it that embodiment's diversity infects perception and knowing, and to quote her, with the embodiment of the subject, experience must be rethought, as it can no longer be understood as the parade of sense data whose character is the same for all perceivers. The parade of sense data whose character is the same for all perceivers. This is exactly how embodied simulation theory generally presents embodied experience. As neutral sense data received by a uniform set of brains. Embodiment in neural simulation theory is unfettered by location, by locatedness. It doesn't mean the partiality of one's vision, because the view is not specific to the identity or biography of the observer, nor does it refer to the partiality of knowledge, since this kind of knowledge is neutrally determined by the neural firing patterns of brains. So I would argue that for Gallese and company, the body appears not so much to be a variable location for experience as it is a stable source of experience. The body is universal and generic in its properties and generates content that could be duplicated in any body. So, for example, the theory suggests that a brain should echo the neural firings of an observed person's brain in certain conditions, or that two different brains would generate the same intentional attunement of an observed other. And on this logic, failure to neurally echo another's felt experience or intentions means that one's your neuron system is broken. And in fact, this is the logic Gallese and others are advancing to argue for a broken neuron system theory of autism, and are pointing to fMRI studies that have found diminished mirroring of motor action in the brains of people diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I find this really fascinating, and some of the people, including Kate, who's wandering in and out here with Maya, I know are really interested in a motor explanation of autism. So I'm not discounting the importance of this. But I'm still worried about it. And here's why. Autism has an incredibly complex etiology, according to pretty much everyone who studies it, and manifests in a wide variety of traits. And in fact, there's debate now about whether or not those different varieties of traits are not going to fall off the autism spectrum, some of them, right, and no longer be considered autism. And since mirroring is still poorly understood, the clinical importance of this hypothesis remains to be seen. But even so, it implies the as yet unspecified standards of normalcy and pathology in mirroring processes. I think it risks preempting the consideration of cultural and inter-individual diversity in mirror neurons and mirror neuron processes. So that's my worry. Relatedly, the frameworks diverge on the role of language and culture. While they both reject abstract reasoning as the primary mode of intersubjective knowledge, feminist epistemologies have generally until recently, insisted on the symbolic and representational or cultural character of knowledge. Now, having said that, as you now know, if you didn't already, that many feminists are now urging a more pragmatic, concrete account of the body and a corresponding break, as Longino puts it, from the representationalism that infects so much epistemology. So I'm referring to the neo-materialist feminist treatments of biology that Patricia was describing. So these treatments of biology are identifying biology to have the same characteristics once thought to be exclusive to culture, like dynamism, malleability, and innovation. And meanwhile, non-representational mechanisms of experience, including affect, are being embraced, and biological processes are being seen as amenable to open-ended theorizing. So a neo-materialist view accepts the significance of the material body in all aspects of human experience, but also demands a fresh idea of biological matter as mattering, as Feng Che put it in the 90s, or always in the process of becoming itself. Mattering is inextricably tied to its ecological context, which includes other people, organic and inorganic objects, animals, and the built world. Mattering then questions the boundaries of and is never reducible to singular objects of matter, and actually puts those objects into question. And it's simultaneously cultural as well as biological, and in fact breaks down that dichotomy. And I think just passed it. So my attempt to build a neo-materialistic kind of the brain asserts that it's plastic and relational and built through a constant interface between neuronal matter and the world, and I see mind is constituted by nature and culture both. And also that these realms are not separate. This view, a biocultural view, fuses the polarity between nature and culture, material and social, and even cell and symbol. And I think that's really the crux of the matter here. So in fact, the embodied mind's capacity to know and feel other minds and bodies can be an expression of the codependence of all of these things. But in contrast to feminist viewpoints described above, both the sort of disembodied version and the neo-materialist version, embodied simulation and related theories seek to constitute themselves against the force of culture. So although Gallese and company describe a dynamic interaction between brain, body, and world in a number of articles that supports mirroring and other sentient-motor processes, the dynamism is bounded by the individual brain and is temporally slowed to the pace of evolution, which is pretty slow. So it's not dynamic enough for me. I will be around to see it. So the brain structures that allow for the generation of concepts, I'm actually referring to something I cut out. Gallese and George Lakoff used embodied simulation theory in combination with the neural theory of concepts to argue not only that mirror neurons support our innate attunement of others, or intersubjectivity, but also that they ultimately feed into symbolic processes, so that they help constitute, along with some other neural mechanisms, they help constitute the representational mind as well. And Lakoff makes that argument in Philosophy of the Flesh, although he doesn't use mirror neurons in particular. Okay, so these structures, though, are predetermined in the sense that they're a consequence of our evolutionary history. This is quote from Lakoff and Gallese, of the way in which our brains and the brains of our evolutionary ancestors have been shaped by bodily interactions in the world. Linguistic, cultural, and historical variations then are diminished in favor of the stable organization of neural networks. And so I would argue that this approach not only favors a uniform picture of the microarchitecture of brains, but it also makes possible reductionist and deterministic claims about culture. And I'm going to throw a provocative example out here that I don't have time to defend, so why not? He's not here. Gallese and David Freeberg, who's an art historian, have advanced a theory of aesthetic experience based on the biologically mandated capacity for empathy given by mirror neurons. So while they don't discount the influence of cultural context in our aesthetic experiences, like our reaction to Jackson Pollock, they preserve a separation between culture and biology. Neurobiology is the basic, fundamental, and universal architect of aesthetic experience, and in particular mirror neurons, that carries on regardless of the effects of culture. And I would argue that this reductionist strategy allows neurobiological research to proceed in isolation from social and cultural analysis, even while it claims authority on cultural matters. And so, of course, that worries me somewhat. I guess it's important to point out here that obviously Dana Freeberg is not going to discount history and culture, but the way they make room for that in this important piece that they wrote together is that they suggest that attending to, this is a paraphrase, attending to history and culture does not essentially change the biological fact or the necessity of mirror neurons as the empathic basis for aesthetic experience. So while there is history, there is culture, these things impact our aesthetic experience. They don't, there's a separation between these two things, these two realms. It's that separation that I find problematic. Not the idea that there's a neurobiological component or in fact that our entire aesthetic experience can be described in neurobiological terms. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is the assumption that history and culture are on some other side of that. So a third issue regards how relationality is understood. I wonder if I could talk through a cough drop. This is going to be a really interesting bodily experiment. I'll try to avoid it. Advocates of embodied simulation theory describe it as a highly relational theory because it does allow for empathy as a part of knowing. It asserts the innate sociality of the brain, and it's intercorporeal. So Gallese, I think, thinks that we would have a good time having a chat at dinner. I mean, he's never met me, he doesn't know who I am, but I think that he would be surprised at how much I dislike his work. Embodied simulation contests the assumptions that I described about cognitive theories of mind. Particularly the view, in the cognitive view, intersubjectivity requires crossing the chasm between mental worlds that are locked away inside the skulls of their subjects. That's a quote from Walter Gannon. But by contrast, neural simulation is mandatory and affords an automatic apprehension of another's mind. So that's an improvement, and yet it still examines intersubjectivity as a problem to be solved within the boundary of the individual brain in a unidirectional fashion. It fails to interact something that's integral to feminist thinking, which is the mutual interaction of subjects. Mutuality is not a focus of attention. And it's because of this limitation, I think, that embodied simulation theory can only account for mind-reading failures through immediately looking to pathology. So finally, I think I've already made this clear, embodied simulation theory diminishes the developmental role of experience in favor of evolution. So little Maya, who's only 3 months old, who's been attending this conference with us, already has an innate mirror neuron system. Based on behavioral and animal studies, Gallese and colleagues argue that mirror neurons are innate. They're also evolutionarily adaptive, and they unfold in individual brains in prenatal, neonatal, and infant life. They hypothesize that we begin life with an innate system which matures through visual and motor development, not psychosocial development. And then we then employ that capacity in our interactions with others. So Catherine Nelson and her colleagues argue in contrast from this feminist psychological pragmatic perspective. Quite the opposite. She argues that as neonates, we're exposed to a socially rich world, like going to a conference when we're 3 months old, which we gradually experience in more complex ways. And it's our pragmatic experience in this world that builds our capacities for a theory of mind, right? So this is the feminist psychological pragmatic view, which maintains that the ability to know another's perspective is a learned skill. And further, at different ages and in different circumstances, including different cultural contexts, different skills may be acquired. Okay, so let's think about that a little bit. There are some problems with that feminist account, even while there are some problems with the embodied simulation account. There's a disconnect between feminist and neuroscientific frameworks that rests on a disconnect between biology and culture in both arguments. But the former, with biology being seen by both frameworks as a predetermined and relatively fixed force, and the latter are richly varied in. Both feminists and neuroscientists see biology as a predetermined, relatively fixed force, which is why they want nothing to do with it. Feminists maintain that the latter, culture, is the richly varied and undetermined one. But I think a more satisfying account, from my point of view, overcomes this opposition by taking more seriously the dynamic interaction of brain, mind, and world that neuro researchers address, or claim to address. So my argument so far is that the dynamism of embodied simulation theory is arrested at one end by evolution, and at the other by a readily normative model of simulation. So the theory fails to account for learning, social context, and non-pathological diversity in brains, persons, and situations. I don't think critique, though, is sufficient anymore. I think that's what part of what Patricia's research program is all about, too. The reworking, I think, in my context, of mirror neuron theory is vital, not only to combat reductionism in neuroscience, but also to clarify its use in non-reductionist social theory, like affect theory. But I take, it's amazing, I'm going back to these people. I take some lessons from feminist epistemologies. The most fundamental contribution of feminist epistemologies, I think, is Donna Haraway's notion of situated knowledges. The notion of embodiment and thus of vision as ineluctably situated. So it's worth returning to Haraway's formulation of this, of situated knowledges. This is from Simeon's Cyborgs and Women, which is 1991. She argues that the physiological and technological structures of vision are a metaphor for its situated embodiment. She also means it literally too, as well as a lesson for the empathic knowing, this idea of empathy in the context of the radical alterity of persons and other beings. So the longer quote that encompasses this shorter quote here is, she mentions the dogs in 1991, by the way. This is kind of amazing. There are lessons which I learned in part walking with my dogs and wondering how the world looks without a fovea and very few retinal cells for color vision, but with a huge neural processing and sensory area for smells. It's a lesson available also from photographs of how the world looks to the compound eyes of an insect, or even from the camera eye of a spy satellite, or the digitally transmitted signals of space probe perceived differences near Jupiter that have been transformed into coffee table photograph books. The eyes made available in modern technological sciences shatter any idea of passive vision. These prosthetic devices show us that all eyes, including our own organic ones, are active perceptual systems, building in translations on specific ways of seeing, that is, ways of life. All these pictures of the world should not be allegories of infinite mobility and interchangeability, but of elaborate specificity and difference, and here we go, the loving care people might take to learn how to see faithfully from another's point of view. Well done, girl. I mean, really. So her conception of vision as active perceptual translation of the world is very compatible with my reading of how mirror neurons work. Let me say that, how mirror neurons might work. Indeed they exist. So, drawing from a range of findings from other people and hypotheses in cognitive science and philosophy, I describe how mirroring can be considered situated, not only metaphorically, but literally, physiologically, context-dependent, learned, and diverse. Based on these claims, I argue that mirroring is a biocultural process that supports our social relations by engaging our own bodies in perceiving the other. To begin with, mirroring is situated in the most literal sense. In fact, it's an awesome example of just what Haraway is talking about. Even in the standard accounts, mirror neurons exemplify what situatedness is at the molecular level. So according to Deleuze, they do not register stimuli as mere visual description that must be processed on a higher order in order for them to have content or meaning. Instead, their activation is inherently meaningful. This is entirely due to their precise locatedness in neural networks that have particular functions and established connections. If neurons that participate in my body's experience of pain also fire when I see Peter Godfrey Smith in pain, meaning does not have to be inferred. It's already there in the activation itself by way of which neurons fire, where they are located, and their synaptic histories. In other words, their connections that have been established already. The involvement of nociceptive or pain sensory neurons in my somatosensory cortex is what associates the activation with pain. In my view, it follows that mirror neurons do not register an objective precept, as embodied simulation theory suggests, but rather generate ineluctably situated content. What they neurally represent is not Peter Godfrey Smith's body in pain, but my bodily experience of perceiving him in pain, which includes a nociceptive element related to pain. So my perception then is not a visual input of something objectively meaningful, but rather an embodied action whose meaning is partly constituted by my own neural and embodied history. An important implication then is that my perception and your perception of a person experiencing pain are not equivalent, even though they might be similar. And it turns out that there's some fMRI studies, which I've just trashed, that establish this. They share the same stimulus, but are different because they're situated in distinct microarchitectures that are located in discrete brains and bodies with singular material histories. So this position happens to be consonant with Sean Gallagher's hypothesis, he's a phenomenologist, that mirroring suggests not simulation but inactive perception. Is that up there? That's the end. Wow. Perception for Gallagher is not the passive reception of information from the environment, but rather an active, skillful, embodied engagement of the world. For him, the coupling of perception and action achieved by mirror neurons suggests motor or somatosensory involvement in perception itself. This is a quote, activation on this interpretation is not the initiation of simulation, it is part of a direct intersubjective perception of what the other person is doing. So on this view, perception is deeply embodied and multimodal, utilizing not just the visual or auditory cortices, but other parts of the brain, like the premotor cortex or nociceptive areas, that are particular to the meaning of the percept as it is actually actively being established. So this is not automatic in the sense that it's skillful. In other words, it's developed through experiences of directly engaging and interacting with others. This view, this theory of inactive perception of Gallagher's, becomes more biocultural if we add some other bits to the mix. If we also address the context of social perception and insist that the biological processes themselves are influenced by experience. So now we will refer to Maria Brinker's work, who's in the audience. So social interaction is situated in particular contexts. Real-life cognition outside the laboratory does not start from a neutral or indifferent position. We have knowledge of and investments in the world that precede our episodic experiences of it and that shape our very perception of it. So think about James Gibson's affordance theory from the 70s, which suggests that perception of the world is shaped by the action possibilities the world affords to the perceiver. When I see a chair, I don't see a wooden sculpture, but a place to sit. If I were a cat, I might see a place to scratch. Later formulations describe affordance, they improve this idea. They describe affordance not as an objective property of the world, even in relation to the perceiver, but as subjective and learned. So, thus, affordances are mediated by experience. So there is, as Maria Brinker puts it, an intentional involvement with the world already in our perceptional pre-action relation to it, and it is this involvement along with background considerations that inform and shape our actual action choice. Brinker insists that perception of the world is marked also by social affordances, not just motor affordances, invitations for action or felt experience that emerge in social interaction. So while social affordance theory asserts the heavily contextual character of perception, a number of empirical studies suggest that mirror activation itself is mediated by context. So I'm going to cite a few of these, but I hope it's clear that I don't think that they're conclusive, but nonetheless useful. So studies by two researchers, Fogassi and Jacoboni, separately suggest that mirroring is diminished or enhanced in scenarios that involve actions in the presence of objects that correlate with a particular goal of that action, or that involve the same actions but different goals. So in other words, the goals are part of the context. One way of interpreting this is that the intention of an action of another is an independent variable, that influences our neural responses to it, but I think a better interpretation is that we often perceive intention and action together. And actions are not always dissociable from their context, or maybe they're rarely dissociable. Also, mirroring may be influenced by memory, so Shirley Fecteau and her colleagues did a study that they argue shows that mirror neurons can be coded by memory. In other words, that they could affect mirror activation with priming the research subjects with a prior precept. So they argue that a symbolic value ascribed to an otherwise neutral stimulus can modulate motor cortical outputs, revealing the influence of top-down inputs on the mirror neuron system. And most interestingly, thanks to Jesse, I read this stuff, a series of studies by Tanya Singer and colleagues suggest that differences in the subject position of the observer, such as economic or gender status, learned attributes of the observed, such as whether they're likable, and the appraisal of a situation have significant effects on mirroring. In one study, for example, men and women were asked to play a prisoner's dilemma game with two players of the same sex, one of whom played fairly and thus was perceived as likable, and the other one who played unfairly and was thus perceived by their subjects as unlikable. And afterwards, the researchers conducted these fMRI scans of subjects while they observed each one of them, the likable and the unlikable person, receiving pain, receiving an electric shock on their hand. You might be surprised by this. Women actually appear to have vicarious activation in their pain areas for both the likable and the unlikable person, while men reserved their vicarious activation only for the people they liked. Which suggests that vicarious activation or mirroring doesn't happen in a symbolic void, that brains mirror in a context saturated with information, including highly cultural and gendered variables. So it might be thought of as a situated bodily experience of perceiving an action that is not dissociable from its context. So this research proposes also that mirroring subjects are inter-individually distinct. And to his credit, in 2009, Gallese wrote that, quote, "The more we study mirroring mechanisms, the more we learn about their plasticity and dependence on the personal history and situated nature of this mirroring subject." So this idea, I think, undermines the hypothesis that mirror neurons are the result of evolutionary adaptation. And Cecilia Hayes has an alternative argument. I'm going to try this now. Let's see if we can do it. Extra cherry movies in case you want to mirror the experience. It's delicious. So her alternative is that mirror neurons are created in individual brains through the experience of perceiving and performing comparable actions. In other words, they're bit. She says the individual starts life with visual neurons that respond to action observation and a distinct set of motor neurons that discharge during action execution. And some of the motor neurons become mirror neurons if the individual gets experience in which observation and execution of similar actions are correlated. For example, when they occur relatively close together in time and one predicts the other. So this is Hebbian learning plus another element. This kind of experience, which forges strong links between visual and motor neurons coding similar actions, is common when human children watch themselves acting or look in a mirror when they're imitated by others. And she gives other examples. So experience does not simply develop mirroring capacities, but produces them in the first place, is her argument. Support for this view comes from fMRI studies of pianists who show more mirror neuron activity than non-musicians while watching piano performances, and similar studies of dancers. I know that Kelly is here, but a lot of dancers are really interested in, and theater people are really interested in mirror neurons for this reason. Hayes also argues that mirror neurons can be trained and untrained. And she cites, I think I'm running out of time, but she cites some really interesting experimental research that makes this case. So not only can training enhance mirroring, but it can transform or reverse established mirroring patterns. So the key point of this, and I'm almost done now, it's good. The key point of the associative hypothesis is that the ontogenetic or individual development of learning is based on, of mirroring is based on learning, including learning from social interaction. If this is correct, according to her, mirror neurons not only support, but are supported by human sociality. They come not from evolution, but from sensory motor experience, and much of this experience is obtained through interaction with others. Therefore, this account implies that mirror neurons are a product as well as a process of social interaction. So this point of view doesn't force a choice between experience on the one hand and neurological capacities on the other. The argument isn't simply that they're both important, but rather that they're co-emergent. Okay, so back to affect theory in my conclusion. So affect theorists are interested in the biological aspects of social relations because they allow for both the materiality and the vitality of intercorporeal experience. The affective portrait of social relations is non-reductively natural, bodily, and open-ended, decenters cognitive processes while moving experience partly out of the range of personal governability. So, we worry about the subject having control, so that's part of what's happening. So it's unsurprising then that affect theorists have leaned on neuroscientific research like this, research, to concretize non-conscious, felt aspects of intercorporeality. And I think mirror neuron research offers a welcome specificity to claims that social relations are biologically material. The vicarious activation of sensory motor neurons can be seen as a mechanism that supports interpersonal resonance and the bodily character of social experience and perception. And this can be theorized in non-reductive ways. However, as a number of critics have worried, most recently, I think, Ruth Blaze in this debate in critical inquiry, an uncritical reliance on neuroscience may reify research values while failing to identify and challenge problematic assumptions in the literature. And my own sense, I'm going to be generous, my own sense is that affect theorists have consciously preempted reductionism by appropriating only neuroscientific findings that they find conducive to their decidedly materialist purposes. But I still think a careful elucidation of the assumptions of mirror neuron research suggests that there's considerable incongruence with neo-materialist affective theorizing, at least the dominant version of mirror neurons that we find in literature. And this dominant theory also contains some objectionable suppositions that are profitably challenged by feminist epistemologies, particularly Haraway's notion of situated knowledge. To my mind, accounts of embodied social relations are most useful when they face head-on the entanglement of the cultural and the natural, the cognitive and the non-cognitive, and the symbolic and the material. And to that end, I've argued for a biocultural view. So to some, I will boldly make these claims. Mirroring is not predictable but context-dependent. Mirror systems are not uniform. Their activations are influenced by social stratifications and by learned symbolic associations. Mirroring is not scripted by evolution. It may be developed by associative learning and through exposures to social interaction. Mirroring is not fixed. It can be transformed, enhanced, or reversed through experience. Mirror neurons do not receive neutral meanings of the other, but generate meanings that reflect locatedness at multiple levels. Together, the situatedness of social cognition, the contextual sensitivity of mirroring, and the acquired and plastic traits of mirror neurons paint a diverse picture of mirroring of brains and of subjects whose bodily felt experiences help us relate to each other. So this view makes biologically determinist theorizing about brain ontology, social relations, aesthetic experience, and culture far less convincing. And more positively, it suggests a truly dynamic relation between the microarchitecture of brains, neuroprocesses, and the social world, and supports an undetermined, open-ended portrait of social cognition. So my view is that mirroring is best understood as a neural mechanism of situated embodied social perception, but even if mirroring is simulation or something else, any interpretation of them, I think, has to grapple with research that undermines a reductionist and determinist view.
Time again, so perhaps I'll take 3 questions. The shorter the question, the longer the answer. So, Jason.
First, thanks for a great talk, Victoria. I think we all experience vicarious pain as you struggled through it with your element, except the men in the room thought you were a bad guy. One way to think about your project is it's a kind of critical apologia for the neuroscience. You want to criticize standard interpretations, but say, let's not get rid of the program, let's just reinterpret what's going on in the brain. But at a more fundamental level, I think there's a radical reversal in how you're thinking about the brain science here. So I want to ask you about that. So the neuroscientists come at this project by saying, here's a puzzle about humanity. We're able to understand the mental states of others, and we're able to empathize with them. How do we explain that? And then they posit a neural mechanism that's supposed to explain these social facts. But on your schema, the order of explanation goes the other way. All kinds of facts about the social are now being used to explain these neurons. So,
Wait, hold on, may I interject?
yeah,
Actually,
I'm done basically.
you've actually described parallel ways of thinking. We know that we mind read, and therefore we have to look for the neural processes in mind reading. That's the neuroscientific interpretation. We know that we learn socially, and therefore we have to find the neural mechanisms of social learning. I think there's no difference between them in terms of their application of assumptions about human nature and their attempt to look for biology that explains that. I think the neuroscientists are doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's all fine. But I guess that what I'm seeing in your project is in effect what you're saying is let's try and use the social to
Yes.
explain the neural.
Agreed.
But at that point, one might wonder what role is the neural, if the neural isn't playing this explanatory role, if it's not driving the ship, if it's not the mechanism, the social is doing the heavy lifting, and the neural, so what role does neuroscience play in social explanation on your story?
Well, my favorite answer to this, and it's pretty short, is that one of the huge implications of the tending to materiality in the context that I'm placing it is that it shows that the consequences of social formations are not simply social consequences, but in fact they may be material consequences. So if what we do in our lives shapes our brains, then gosh, cultural hierarchies and social hierarchies are even more problematic than we thought.
Any more questions?
Have you come across anything like, aside from Alan Shore and anything else like that, which would talk about the connection between attachment theory, affect regulation, dysregulation,
I don't know that literature, but I think it's being applied. This work is being applied to attachment theory too, and schizophrenia, and a couple of other realms.
Thanks. You make a lot of references in what you're talking about to the observer and the observed and the subject and the object and the me and you and me and this person and all that kind of thing. And that makes sense to me on sort of a basic experiential common level. But what I'm having trouble understanding, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is how we maintain that kind of language of self and other when the idea of self and what's going on in my body is so almost simultaneous or at least determined or reactive to what I usually consider to be you or the other. So I'm having trouble dealing with that.
You mean in the neuroscientific literature, in the mirror neuron account?
How do we talk about these processes that seem to flummox out the normal language of you and me and self and other? We keep on using them, but it seems like we're not actually talking about them
Agreed.
anymore.
I agree, and I don't know the answer to your question, but I think you're absolutely right. So, in a sense, there's a kind of anachronistic clumsiness to this whole project, an attempt to use old language, make it fit to some new conditions. So I think we have some work to do, the royal we, myself included. Yeah. I just think you're right.
I have a question that you might not be interested in.
Good.
Norbert Elias has this huge explanation of the growth of social control through civilizational processes, but he has very little kind of actual mechanism as to why that would take place. And it struck me that had Norbert Elias been around, this theory could actually have helped him explain this evolutionary change. There's a book that's come out by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Ourselves, I think it is, which is trying to explain the growth of social control. And so I mean, is there a place in these evolutionary theories of social change for social control of this kind of mechanism?
Okay, I have to be honest here.
You don't like what I said, this makes it totally uninteresting from your...
It's not uninteresting, it's horrifying.
Yes.
I've always, I think he's a beautiful writer, but I've always hated his work because of its attempt to write this. Elias. That's sweet, and I know why you're saying that, because Pinker is an egregious example, and Elias is not. Elias is wonderful in many ways, and we owe a lot to him, and yet I can't bear the meta-narrative that he's claiming, and I would hate for him to be doing scientific work, because I think it would feed into the really problematic evolutionary stuff that's going on. Although maybe I'm wrong about him.
The very simple explanation that I thought of, which the more non-aggressive people that are around, the less aggressive I'm likely to be. Is that what the theory comes down to?
No,
Mm.
because you're a man.
Mm.
You're a man.
How do you know?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I wanted to just add, because I really enjoyed the presentation so much. It raised for me questions about, as I'm sure we're going to get to talk about how to ontologically stabilize some of the arguments you're making,
Yeah,
in order that it doesn't just go back to culture and social and
Yeah.
situated, and that we've traveled through all this for not a whole lot of reasons, but also what measure is, so that I was thinking, oh wow, Patricia, you have to work harder on your stuff to make it address some of these questions, because one of the reasons I'm so interested in what I'm doing, besides the craziness of it at times, is that it's asking, where is the technology now, where is the measure now, who isn't there, who is there, you know, like, even if that's not what they're saying, they're trying to create a different language. If you start with a dynamic matter, how do you keep on mapping that original dynamism? And, you know,
I think that's an awesome question, and another version.
it's not a question, it's like a plea.
Yeah, but can't answer, can't help you. But another version, a more simplistic version that came up for me in discussing with other colleagues this week was, and I granted it's a reduction of your comment here, but it's a version of it, is where is the resistance of matter, the recalcitrance of matter? Because the materialist move is to reclaim matter and the recalcitrance of matter. It's dynamic, but if it's wholly plastic, then it's just simply cultural.
This is why white death is good, because things actually form.
I wrote that down. As you're talking, I'm thinking, yes, exactly. Things actually form. And I think at some point in my book project, I'm going to have to talk about how plasticity slows down and maybe the constraints of plasticity.
I'll suggest one more question, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to try and finish, because I think we'll need a 5-minute break
Agreed.
just to stand up and move around. Yes,
I
thank
just
you.
want to dovetail on what you just said. So it seems that there's an innate conflict built in, because in order to be cultural, culture is built on expectation and stability to a certain extent, but then you have plasticity because it's dynamic. And I think that's one of your major conflicts in there.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay. How about we take a 5-minute break?